Good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you for bearing with us as we engaged in the organized chaos that is a conference like this. We have folks who have come in from all over the country for Keep LA Moving 2019, and I'm just going to introduce the... Well, let's start with that. Raise your hand if you drove more than 10 miles to be here. Okay. Or rode your bike. Raise your hand if you traveled more than 100 miles. All right. Anybody come more than 1,000 miles? I know at least one, Matthew Schneider over there, came all the way from Iowa. So the point is that this is truly a national conference. You know, 3 years ago, the folks who live in Playa del Rey and Playa Vista woke up on a Monday morning, got in their cars, drove down to Jefferson Boulevard and Culver Boulevard, and sat there for about 90 minutes. And that was the first experience a lot of Angelenos had with these things that we've become near and dear to our hearts, called road diets. Indeed. What happened in Playa del Rey is emblematic of what's happening not just in Los Angeles, not just in California, but literally nationwide. According to a leading advocacy group, there are 1,500 jurisdictions around the country these days that have complete streets, vision zero, living streets. They go by various euphemisms, but the point of all of them is to replace as much road space from cars and hand it over to transit, bike lanes, etc. Now, it's very important at the outset. Nobody in this room, I think I can probably speak for most, if not all of us, is anti-bike. Being anti-bike is like being anti-puppy dog or being anti-sunshine. Nobody is anti-bike. The reason that we're here today, the reason people have traveled from far and wide to be here is because of certain types of road diets like the one right out here on Venice Boulevard. And at some point today, I will almost guarantee you that you will see an ambulance or a fire engine get bogged down trying to get to a scene. You'll see a video a little bit later on. A few months ago, it took 4 minutes to travel 3 blocks. And right down there at the corner of Venice and Grandview, there was a motorcyclist pinned under a semi-truck. That's where the ambulance was trying to get, and they couldn't get there because of a road diet. So today we're going to be talking about those impacts, the unintended consequences of these projects. We're going to talk about the unintended, or perhaps intended, depending on if you're like me and at this point you have an entire closet full of tinfoil hats, on business, on communities, on neighbors. These projects turn neighbor against neighbor. This road diet out here is less than a mile. It's 0.8 miles long. It's barely 2 years old. 25 businesses have closed since it went in. Oh, we're up to 33. We have spoken to people in Washington, D.C., in Waverly, Iowa, in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, in Fairbanks, Alaska. And the impacts are so similar and so common that we've started calling it the playbook. This project was supposed to be a pilot. We were promised by the DOT, by the city council, by the mayor himself, whose name I will not utter today, that if it didn't work, it's just paint. We can take it back, we can reverse it. Well, 33 shattered dreams later, God knows how many emergencies later, it's still there. I spoke to a fire battalion captain in Fairbanks, Alaska, a few months ago. And he said that they had installed a road diet and bike lanes in front of his station. The impact on his response time has been so dramatic and so bad that they actually installed special metering lights for the fire station. They didn't reverse the road diet. They put in a couple $100,000 worth of traffic lights instead. Now, I asked the chief up there, what's the average temperature in Fairbanks in January? He said, it's about 0. And I said, now, chief, in your opinion as a professional first responder, would riding a bicycle for any amount of time in Fairbanks in January kill you? And he just laughed. The reason I tell that anecdote is that it reveals that we are not talking about serious engineering. The people you're going to be hearing from today are serious-minded, data-driven people. They're engineers, they're scholars, They take a very evidence-based approach. Unfortunately, the individuals responsible for these projects are not engineers in most cases. The current head of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation has a bachelor's degree in history from Brown University. That is the extent of her engineering background. So our communities are being vastly disrupted by an ideology. And again, we're going to hear from people today who are bike advocates. We are inviting people who radically disagree with us because we are seeking common ground. And so I hope one of the things that you guys take away from today is not only where we disagree, but where we can find that common ground. And equally importantly, what you can take back to your communities in terms of knowledge, in terms of tactics, in terms of knowing who to contact and how to contact them. That's going to be our final panel. And I hope you can all stay for the final panel, because that's going to be the nuts and bolts of what you can do when you go home so that you spend this day here today, not just more knowledgeable and more enlightened, but more able to act in your communities. Before I turn it over to our first panel, I just want to thank the folks, again, who have traveled from far and wide. I'd like to thank our sponsors, particularly the National Motorist Association, the American Dream Coalition, the Mar Vista for letting us use their space. Yes, please, give it up, give it up. I'd like to thank folks like Matthew Schneider, who came all the way from Waverly, Iowa, another community, a small Midwestern agricultural community, about 11,000 people, and they have a road diet on Main Street. So with that sort of set in that frame, I'm going to turn it over to our first panel. Randal O'Toole from the Cato Institute. Wendell, there he is, come on up, Wendell. And Jay Beeber from Safer Streets LA, and I'll let them introduce themselves because they can do a far better job than I can. The way these panels are going to work, just really quickly logistically, each panelist is going to give a presentation. Some are going to use PowerPoint, some are just going to speak. We'll then have a panel-led discussion, and then we will love to hear your thoughts and your questions as well. So that's going to kind of be the flow of the day. So without further ado, and Mariya Frost from the Washington, who's traveled all the way from Washington, who is going to moderate the first panel. Mariya, sorry about that.
No worries. All right. All right. Well, my name is Mariya Frost, and I'm the Transportation Director at Washington Policy Center, an independent, nonpartisan, free market think tank based in Seattle, Washington. We have 8 research arms and 4 offices in different parts of the state. The Center for Transportation, which is what I run, researches and analyzes best practices for relieving traffic congestion with a specific focus on highway and transit projects and how public tax dollars are spent. We support people getting to the places that they want to go, the way that they want to get there, not the way that government planners want them to get there. Traffic calming, road diets, Vision Zero are planning efforts that are being executed at local, state, and national levels. Seattle, which has the 6th worst traffic congestion in the nation, has had an infatuation with road diets for years, resulting in worsening traffic congestion and crippled infrastructure that will not be able to accommodate future growth. This is why I couldn't miss this conference. I wanted to learn more from our expert panelists about the impact of road diets and Vision Zero planning on mobility and quality of life, and how to articulate our concerns and how to find solutions that really honor all road users. As a practical example, in 2017, a propane truck overturned on Interstate 5 in Seattle during rush hour, closing the freeway and causing mass diversion to downtown arterials, effectively paralyzing the region for hours. The Seattle Times editorial board wrote an excellent article after the incident, admitting that the closure of arterials and replacement of lanes with bike paths made the situation significantly worse. The problem isn't adding bike paths, they said. It's that the city did so by reducing general traffic capacity. This makes the street network less resilient and capable of handling surges and more dependent on I-5. They argued what Washington Policy Center has argued for years, that policy should be guided by total capacity and demand, not cherry-picked statistics and wishful assumptions. I agree, but determining what those policies should be is easier said than done. Our first panel today will help us begin that conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them, and then they will each have 15 minutes to present. I will be in the audience taking notes with the rest of you, and then we'll come back up. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So first we have Wendell Cox, who's a native of Los Angeles. He's principal of Demographia, an international urban policy consulting firm based in St. Louis. He was appointed by Mayor Tom Bradley to 3 terms on the Los Angeles County Transportation Commission, which was later merged with the Southern California Rapid Transit District to form Metro. He also served 9 years as a visiting professor at Paris University. In the middle, we have Randal O'Toole, who's a Cato Institute senior fellow, specializing in land use and transportation issues. His recent books include Romance of the Rails, Why the Passenger Trains We Love Are Not the Transportation We Need, and American Nightmare, How Government Undermines the Dream of Homeownership. Before working for Cato, he taught environmental economics at Yale, UC Berkeley, and Utah State University. And on the end, we have Jay Beeber, who's the executive director of Safer Streets LA, which is a grassroots organization dedicated to the interests of the motoring public through the adoption of scientifically sound and sensible transportation and traffic laws. Mr. Beeber is best known for ending LA's abusive and costly red light camera ripoff, saving Angelenos over $200 million. As a city council candidate in this year's special election, he made zoning, development, and congestion central to his campaign. A graduate of the University of Michigan, he lives right here in LA. So with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Randal, who will go first, and then Wendell and Jay, and I will come back up afterward. Thank you.
We're going to talk today about, this morning, less about road diets than about the mentality that people who are proposing road diets have. These people are urban planners or planning enthusiasts. They believe in top-down planning, that planners should have a major influence on society. The planners believe that Americans drive too much. They believe that the single-family homes most of us live in waste a lot of land. It's been the goal of planners for decades to get people to live in denser housing, multifamily housing, and then ride transit. Now, does anybody here not know what the densest urban area in the United States is?
LA, Washington, D.C.
Okay, LA is the right answer. Los Angeles is the densest urban area. By urban area, I'm including, or the Census Bureau is including, lots of Orange County and Pasadena and stuff like that. It's not just the city. But the Los Angeles urban area has almost 7,500 people per square mile, according to the 2018 census data. Comparatively, New York is only 5,400 people per square mile. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose are all denser than New York. And yet, you look around here, and I don't see people giving up their car. People are still driving, even though it's the densest community. So all the densification that's happened, in Los Angeles, only about 4,000 people per square mile a few decades ago. So all the densification that's happened hasn't led people to give up their car. So why do urban planners insist on density as a solution to all of their problems? Well, it really goes back to the 1930s, and this man, who was an architect, he was a Swiss-French architect, who called himself Le Corbusier, and Wendell Cox thinks he should have been shot. A planning historian once called him the Rasputin of urban planning because he led planners down the wrong direction. He thought everybody should live in high-rise housing. Everybody, every urban resident should live in high-rise housing. No low-rise, no mid-rise, all high-rise. He himself never in his life ever lived in high-rise housing, but he wanted to impose it on everybody else. And for some reason, planners glommed onto this, and after World War II, you saw high-rise housing all over London, saw high-rise housing all over Germany. This is a West Berlin high-rise development designed by Le Corbusier. East Germany, Moscow, Korea, Hong Kong, the United States. Governments all over the world started building high-rise housing like crazy because this wacko architect said so. Then, in about 1960, New York City planners wanted to turn a neighborhood of New York into high-rise housing. And they hadn't counted on the fact that a woman named Jane Jacobs lived in that neighborhood. And she successfully fought them off. They'd called her neighborhood a slum. And so she wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she argued, first of all, that urban planners don't understand how cities work. And second of all, that her neighborhood wasn't a slum. Well, she was absolutely right about urban planners not understanding how cities worked. Most of the high-rise housing developments in the United States, and most of the ones in Britain for that matter, that were built after World War II have been demolished because they proved within a very short time to be totally unlivable. Now the problem is that Jane Jacobs lived in Greenwich Village, which is mid-rise housing. It's 4 to 6 story buildings. Often there's shops on the ground floor and then there's apartments up above. Urban planners read her book. She was just defending this and saying it wasn't a slum. They read her book and they said, yes, she's right, we're wrong. We shouldn't try to force everybody to live in high-rise housing. We should try to force everybody to live in mid-rise housing. And so there's a group called the Congress for the New Urbanism. They have as their credo that all new development should be mid-rise dense housing. And all existing suburbs, every single one of them, should be reconfigured into mid-rise housing. They don't see any place at all for single-family homes. So when you hear this California state legislature wants to pass a bill to eliminate single-family zoning, it's all part of this new urbanist idea that multifamily housing is better, single-family housing is bad. And so we see places like this is in Portland, but you can find examples like this, block after block of mid-rise housing being built as if we're in Greenwich Village. And yet there's no need for that. The urban planners say, well, we have to save farmland. Well, it turns out more than half the United States is agricultural land. We only use 1/3 of the agricultural land for growing crops. Not because the rest of it is being urbanized, but because we don't need that much. And in fact, crop productivity is growing faster than our population. So the number of acres we need for growing crops is declining every year. So we see that most of the land in the country is rural, and it's extremely abundant. In California in particular, 95% of the state is rural. 95% of the people in the state are confined to the 5.5% of the state that's urban because of a variety of land use laws that most people have never even heard of. You can't build a housing development like, say, Irvine anymore out in a rural area. And so people end up getting denser and denser. And so we're creating a shortage of housing, we're creating a shortage of transportation in order to save something that's extremely abundant, which is farming. Well, then the urban planners say, well, new urbanism reduces crime. And the American Planning Association published this book called Safescape. It talked all about how new urbanism and high-density housing and mixed-use developments reduce crime. It provided not one iota of evidence. All it did is it quoted Jane Jacobs. It had no evidence that it reduced crime. And so an architect named Oscar Newman sat down and actually gathered evidence. He looked at thousands of city blocks and he compared the architectural features on those blocks with the amount of crime. And what he found was all the things the new urbanists want make crime worse. High-density housing, mixed-use developments, lots of common areas and little private land, alleys in back, no cul-de-sacs, all gridded streets. All of these things made crime worse. He wrote a series of books about defensible space and how the way to have less crime is to have more single-family homes, more private land, and things like that. That reduces crime. So that shot that argument. Well, then the urban planner said, obesity. Everybody's afraid of being fat. Well, the suburbs made people fat. We need to have more high-density housing because high-density housing makes people thin. Now, I'm not sure whether they're getting that, but the Center for Disease Control did a survey and found, yes, people in suburbs do weigh an average of 1 pound or 2 more than people in cities. Wow. And a study by Oregon State University and several other academics found the reason why that is because fat people like to live in suburbs. It's not because the suburbs made them fat, it's because they chose to live in suburbs. So that blows that argument. Well, now the argument they're using is that high-density housing is affordable housing. So they build these high-density developments. They typically cost $500 a square foot, and they call them affordable. Why are they affordable? Because they have about 500 square feet per apartment. But it's not affordable, really. When you build mid-rise or high-rise housing, the cost per square foot doubles, triples, goes up to 7 or 8 times as much as the cost of low-rise housing. So the whole idea that we can solve Los Angeles' affordability problems by increasing densities is not going to work. It's actually going to make the problems worse. Now let's look at density versus driving, because the whole point is urban planners want to reduce driving. Urban planners want to densify cities so that we will reduce driving. All the other stuff is just excuses they use, but really they want to reduce driving, and they think that denser development reduces driving. So the Census Bureau every year asks people, how do you get to work? So we've got good data on how people get to work in urban areas all over the country, and we can compare that with density. Okay, we can look at this chart. This shows for about 400 urban areas the density and what percentage of people drive to work. Now here's Los Angeles, way over here. So densest urban area, about 90% of people in Los Angeles drive to work. It might be 89%, but it's not any less than that. Now there are some that are lower than that, but notice they aren't necessarily dense. New York is in there. But most of those are college towns. Davis, Eugene, Boulder, other college towns that have a high percentage of young people who bicycle and walk to work. And so it's not the density that's making them not drive. But if we look at the overall chart, we see, yes, come on, let's go back. Yes, there is a slight effect. If you increase density, there is a slight reduction in driving, but you have to have a massive increase in density to make it noticeable. On this chart, it shows that a 7-fold increase in density, going from 1,000 to 7,000 people per square mile, will reduce driving by about 10%. So you do the math, that means there's 530% more cars out there clogging up the roads. And cars pollute more and they waste more energy in congested traffic. So you're actually going to have a lot more pollution and a lot more congestion in the denser cities. In fact, economists from the UC Irvine specifically looked at whether we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy with density and other changes in the urban form. And he said, yes, there is an effect, but it's too small to be useful in cleaning up the air or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And now there's transit. Bus transit in LA is plummeting. I think it's lost something like 25% in the last 5 years. And Philip Washington, the CEO of LA Metro, wants to build bus lanes all over the place. Take away car lanes and make them exclusive bus lanes. And he specifically said he wants to do that to make streets more congested, to make it hard for people to get to work by car, so he can get a few more people riding his buses. In other words, he wants to reduce the quality of life for the 90% of people who drive to work in order to enhance the quality of life for the 5% of people who take transit to work. And maybe it'll make it 5.1%, but actually it'll probably make it 4.9%. Sometimes we have to tell people what's good for them. Government knows best. Specifically, planners know best. So, what should we do instead? I'm just going to give you a real quick idea for an alternative to this road diet out here. This picture you may recognize was taken just down the block here. Instead of a road diet, I recommend, and John Forrester may have a different opinion, bicycle boulevards. That's where you take a street that's parallel to, say, Venice, that's a local street, and you say, encourage bicycle use on this street. You put in a few barriers so that you allow local traffic, but you don't allow local automobile traffic, or you don't encourage through automobile traffic to use that street.
But provided the cyclists obey the traffic laws.
Right. But you take away as many stop signs as you can so that bicyclists can get through there as efficiently as possible. And looking at the map, a street called Victoria Avenue, which is a few blocks north of here, would be a good place to do it. So that's just my idea as an alternative to this road diet, and I bet the planners who planted this road diet never considered that as an alternative. Planning, rational planning, means you look at alternatives, but they don't do that anymore because they know what's best for us. Now, if you're interested in more information, I have a few copies of my book, The Best Laid Plans, here, and I encourage you to look at my website, which is called The Anti-Planner. That's how I feel about urban planners. Google Anti-Planner, and I'm the first thing on the list. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I am, as Mariya indicated, I'm a native of LA. I was born in a house at Temple in Alvarado many, many years ago. I think we were just beginning to develop that part of town at that time. Wendell Cox, C-O-X. In any event, I'm going to be doing a presentation in similar vein to that what Randal has just done. He focused more broadly on the urban planning aspects in terms of especially housing and land use. I'll be focusing a little bit more on mobility as a result of my 3 terms on the LA County Transportation Commission. But I also want to let you know sort of what I've been doing since I left the city in '85 and have spent an awful lot of time. I publish every year with a guy in New Zealand, the Demographic International Housing Affordability Survey. We've done it now for 15 years, and we are widely quoted around the world rating metropolitan housing affordability in 9 countries. I also do an annual volume called Demographia World Urban Areas, where we take that kind of urban form that Randal was talking about, the urban area. The urban area is the continuously developed area. The continuously developed area of Los Angeles, you could argue, starts somewhere just below Santa Clarita, goes to San Clemente, goes out to Chatsworth, and goes out actually to about Banning or Beaumont. That's the urban area. The Census Bureau does it a little differently, but the point is, what we do in that is an annual update of densities of all of the urban areas in the world of more than 500,000. And it's quite a project. But in any event, to try to get to what the real things are, I want to congratulate you because you all live in the megacities being urban areas of more than 10 million people, the megacity with the best work trip travel time in the world. You want to know who has the best transportation system in the world of the megacities? Los Angeles has it. I'm serious. And on this chart, for example, we see in London 37 minutes, LA 27. Now, these are older data because I had to go back to the late 2000s because the other city data is a little bit older. New York 34, Seoul, Tokyo 50. And interestingly, and I feel real bad about what's going on in Hong Kong at the moment, but interestingly, Hong Kong, which is really nirvana with respect to urban planning, 65,000 people per square mile, as opposed to LA's 7 or New York's 5. 70 or 80% of the people of trips are on transit. It is nirvana with respect to urban planning and urban containment, yet the average work trip travel time is 47 minutes. That's 20 minutes more than Los Angeles. So the point is, urban planning has failed there, and that is the goal they have. In any event, this is a chart similar to Randall's. This gives you the actual data. My data is from 2010. Randall was using data from 2018. But this is the population density of the largest, of the most dense urban areas among the top in the United States. Now, a lot of people always, will reel back and say, how can it be that LA is denser than New York? Well, it's real simple. This picture shows it very, very well. The one side shows you an aerial view of the Ontario area just to the west of the airport. We're still at about 6,000 per square mile there, 35 miles from downtown. The other side shows you the New Jersey suburbs, 35 miles from Manhattan, and you can see that. So the fact that LA suburbs are similarly built in terms of density all the way to the edge of the city is the reason that LA does so well on density. Now, a lot of people think that downtown is where the action is. And in fact, downtown is the action. It's the only place that transit ridership in this country is substantial. Something like 59% of all the work trip destinations and transit in the United States are in 6 cities. Not 6 metropolitan areas, 6 cities. The city of New York, the city of Philadelphia, and 4 others, you can probably guess them. The rest of the transit ridership is in the suburbs of those cities and in the other parts of the country. In fact, and so this is work by Peter Gordon, who is a professor emeritus of economics at USC, basically looked at employment by type of employment area throughout the United States. And the overall data shows that among metropolitan areas of more than 1 million people, this was done in the mid-2000s, 81% of the jobs were in dispersed areas. Downtowns averaged 7% of the jobs. LA, by the way, is 2.4%. And edge cities or suburban secondary centers, if you can call them that, like Century City, Long Beach, Costa Mesa, they had about 12%. So the point is, a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what the urban form looks like. And anybody that tells you we can't build here because you won't be able to get to downtown doesn't understand how insignificant downtown has become. True, those buildings are impressive, and they're a hell of a lot more impressive than they were 50 years ago. But the fact is, downtown employment in Los Angeles is pretty flat, and it's never going to be much more than it is today. And your transit ridership, studies have shown, is largely driven by downtown employment. That's in the United States. Now, urban planning, which Randall talked about, got a really good start in the early 1900s. The planners wanted to help people. The conditions, especially in London where it really started, were just plain terrible. We're interested in helping the poor. Unfortunately, as a number of people have suggested, urban planning has really gotten off track. It's gotten off into urban design and urban form. They have nothing to do with affluence. That's all that counts. All I care about is how good is the standard of living and how are we doing in terms of eradicating poverty. That's all that matters. And if planning does that, fine. If it doesn't, it's got a problem. Paul Cheshire, probably one of the best urban economists in the world at the London School of Economics with his colleagues, basically said in response to all that, the ultimate objective of urban policy is to improve outcomes for people rather than places. And Alan Berteau of the World Bank, former principal planner at the World Bank, put it, I think, very well. He said the fundamental interest of the urban planner should be improving mobility and improving housing affordability. Now, again, it's hard to find a place where that's gone more awry here. We've seen in Los Angeles, and as Randall indicated, we have seen around the world, the attempts and the interest of urban planners in stopping mobility by the automobile, even though modern society could not exist without the automobile. Here we see a map from 1947 of the freeway plan at that point. You can see, it's probably hard to see, but there are a number of freeways there. You may all remember, actually most of you won't remember, you know, the Route 90, probably most of you don't remember the days when it used to be called the Richard M. Nixon Freeway. They pulled those signs down in the middle 70s. I don't remember why. But in any event, the fact is, by some accounts, about 40% of the LA freeway system was once built. Why does LA have the worst traffic congestion in the country? Well, it has the highest density, and it killed a good percentage of its freeway system. So that's a real problem, and that means it takes longer to get to work, and it reduces access. Now, the urban area or the metropolitan area, which we're talking about, is really the unit that you use in this kind of an analysis. The city is justified by its economics. The city is a labor market. It is the very purpose of cities. And you need mobility throughout to improve the economy in the long run. And by the way, a lot of people, including the state of California, seem to think you can develop urban villages within urban areas and have everybody sort of work close to home and so on. Alain Berthaud put it pretty well from the World Bank. He said the urban village is a figment of the imagination of planners. There is no evidence in the world anywhere that that's ever happened. Plenty of evidence by misled researchers that it might happen, but no evidence that it can happen. And so what that gets us to is the crucial issue of accessibility, because you can't hardly open a newspaper or watch television without hearing somebody greatly concerned about the rising inequality. And that's of society, inequality of wealth and inequality of income. Those are legitimate concerns. Mobility is crucial to that. If you want to reduce inequality, you better make sure people can get to work. And we got some real problems on that. So the University of Minnesota has done some wonderful access research where they basically said, how many jobs in the average metropolitan area can the average worker get to in 30 minutes? Which, by the way, every city in the United States, the work trip travel time is about that or less, except for just a few. And the numbers are stunning. In Los Angeles, for example, and this is the LA metropolitan area, which includes Orange County, 1.3 million jobs are within 30 minutes access of the average worker. By transit, 39,000. In other words, transit has 33 times, the car will get you to 33 times as many jobs. That says it all. Because if you're dependent on buses and if you're dependent on metro, you can't get to work. You don't have nearly the choices that others have. And when you think about the concentration of poverty in this community and every other community in the United States, especially in lower income, in minority groups and so on, this is a real problem. So you go beyond that, not only can't you get most places on transit, but if you can, it's going to take you almost twice as much. The work trip travel times are much longer. Now, in that regard, I remember in the mid-'80s, or mid-2000s, with my department head in Paris, the late Jean-Claude Zive, we did some research and we said, okay, so we want to have an automobile competitive transit system, a transit system that can replace the automobile. Great idea. What would it cost? Well, we did some research on that, and we basically found, on average, it would cost about the entire income of a metropolitan area every year. In Los Angeles, our number was about 53%. It can't be done. It's not surprising that only Jean-Claude and I did the modeling, because any urban planner that did it would know from the start it wouldn't work. So let's finish up with a few thoughts about mobility in Los Angeles. When I was on the commission, I left in 1985. I suppose I should take credit for the fact that the peak RTD ridership, Tom, is that all right, was 497 million. Peak ridership on the LA transit system, 497 in 1985. I had nothing to do with that, by the way. Okay, after that, you see what happens, and we are on a downward climb. Now, what have we done since that time? We have built, I'm not sure what the latest number is, but somewhere we probably spent $25 billion at this point on a rail system. How can it be? I can tell you that those of us on the commission who approved the rail system, and I was there, did not conceive that it was going to reduce mobility. Now, Randall's argued in a recent brief very well with respect to the national situation. What transit is doing is driving off people with special needs and low-income people and attracting people with briefcases, but not enough to make up the difference. So that's a big deal. We are so bad, the new 2018 numbers that just came out a couple of weeks ago are showing that the work trip market share in Los Angeles County has dropped to almost 1970 levels. It's now 5.7%. This is not the metropolitan area, this is LA County. So that's pretty bad when you consider the things that had been done to make a very impressive ridership increase in this community. Now, let's talk about what's happened since rail. The 1990 census was held about 2 months before the Blue Line opened. Since that, and so the 1990 census gives us a good area to look at to find out what's happened since that time. Driving alone has increased by 700,000, transit by 10,000, and working at home by about 160,000. You want to know what the difference is in the subsidies between working at home and transit? The difference between about 0 and much more than $25 billion. Now, let's talk about some real, and Randall's already covered this, but let me give you a few more thoughts here. Phil Washington, and I have a lot of respect for Phil. He did a nice job in Denver, was appointed, or was the assistant to a dear friend of mine who passed away, Cal Marcella, who was the RTD general manager there. Phil has said it's too easy to drive. The city needs to actually make driving harder. We need to change behavior. Now, this is the CEO of the MTA. Now, don't let anybody think that the MTA is a transit agency. The MTA is over highway planning as well as transit. That doesn't sound like anybody that is concerned about driving. Now, let's look at the context of where MTA is today. Measure M. You all in this community voted on a proposition that had these items on the ballot. Improve freeway traffic flow. How does that comport with what Washington says? And I am not criticizing him, but I'm very concerned that you have increased the sales tax and extended another one for beyond 2039 to, first of all, improve traffic flow. And if you want to go out and take a survey of people who drive in this town and live in this town, you know, I'll bet traffic congestion among transportation issues is about as high as it goes. When do we get to expand rail, bus and subway system? Number 7. It sounds to me like the PR people must have gotten to Metro to make sure that it was buried deep enough that nobody saw it. People are interested in traffic congestion. Everybody thinks transit's the answer. Let me tell you, it's not. All of your members at Metro are elected officials. I can remember in long time ago in '76 when they put on the Diamond Lane on the I-10 freeway, the Santa Monica, when it was in for 2 months and Kenny Hahn, supervisor, and others objected because of the community reaction, and it was taken off in just about 4 months. So the key is to focus on mobility. Think about this. When you have a situation where you're poor, you're a single parent, let us say, you've got to drop the kid off at daycare. What do you think are the chances of your being able to find any job of any, or certainly not the best job, using transit? Or what if you don't even have a kid, but now you can get to the jobs that are essentially on one transit line? The fact is, transit does not provide the access that's needed. It does a great job to get people downtown, and we need to find ways to do a better job with respect to low-income people. If we do not have sufficient mobility, we limit employment and we reinforce inequality. So this requires keeping the traffic moving and doing better things with respect to low-income people who are forced to use transit, and the coming of the automated car in the long run could give us some marvelous opportunities. But let me say this, because we hear so much about inequality. We need to think of it this way. Inequality cannot be reduced without improving mobility, because it is at the very heart of inequality. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to this conference. It's a really important issue that we're going to be talking about all day today. So, as was mentioned, my name is Jay Beeber, and I am the Executive Director of Safer Streets LA. Safer Streets LA was born out of my efforts to eliminate the red light cameras here in Los Angeles. And just a little bit of quick background on that so people understand where that came from. I did not approach the issue of transit or transportation from an ideological standpoint. I was in the entertainment industry. We had some downtime, and I saw a report on the news that said that red light cameras were causing more collisions, not less collisions. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I have a science background. I wonder why that is. And so I started looking into it. And when I looked into it, I found out that the issues were much more complex than what the public was being led to believe, what the elected officials were being led to believe, and that this was being driven by an industry and certain ideology that simply said that penalizing enough people will make your road safer. So I got involved in it. We got rid of the red light cameras, but what I found out through that process was that you can make roadways and intersections safer with regards to red light running by simply doing proper engineering. And when you do proper engineering, such as you set your yellow light time appropriately, you can reduce red light running significantly. So next thing that I set out to do was to change the rules for the state of California and go back to the old rules that existed before the mid-1990s, which was to use what they call the 85th percentile speed of traffic. That is the speed that 85% of the people on the roadway drive at that speed or less, rather than the posted speed limit, which usually has very little relationship because of political fiat to the actual speeds on the roadway. And once we did that, lo and behold, red light running went down significantly. In some places like Beverly Hills, there are places where red light running went down over 90% at some locations. And so the message from that, for me, was that if you do proper engineering, if you have the data, if you have the proper information, you can make important change. And so I'm a data-driven person, and I'm usually the person here that's spouting statistics like Randal and Wendell are. But today I was asked to talk a little bit more about the big picture as far as a lot of the stuff that you're hearing about with road diets and mobility and transit and bike lanes and this sort of thing. So, so with that, I will let you also know that I am a completely nonpartisan person. I don't hew to any particular political ideology. I simply hate stupidity. So that's why I kind of fall where I fall on a lot of these things, and I try as much as any human being can to be driven by facts and data rather than ideology. So, and I'm also somebody who believes that we need transit in the right places, and I think everybody in this room probably agrees with that. Where that should be is an important conversation, but as you've heard before, the movement towards putting transit everywhere and only transit and eliminating mobility by cars is not going to get us where we need to be in terms of mobility, in terms of prosperity, and in terms of quality of life here in the city of Los Angeles and around the world. What you should know is that when we talk about bike lanes, when we talk about some of the stuff that my fellow panelists were talking about, and we say, well, they have good information, why don't the planners get this? Why don't the elected officials get this? The reason is, to some extent, and I'm not saying about everybody that advocates for these things, but to some extent, this is part of a much broader ideology. It's a much broader picture that these people are pushing for. And so it's not about bike lanes, it's not about a road diet, it's about social engineering. Because there are people out there who believe that they know better than you how you should live your life. They think they know how you should get around, when you should get around, where you should do it, where you should live, how you should live, because they know better than the individual about how you should live your life. And for some of these people, they're well-intentioned, but they really and truly honestly believe that you know how to live your life better, that they know how to live your life better than you do. One thing I know about, for 100% certainty, and there's not very many things in the world that I know 100%, is that you know how to live your life better than I know how to live your life. So what does this social engineering look like? Well, it very much mirrors what's going on in the conversations in our society, which have to do with promoting certain things that these people want to accomplish. So they want to promote perfect safety. They want to promote and solve the climate change problem. They want to eliminate pollution. They want to have no environmental impact on the planet whatsoever. They want to have health and fitness and deal with the obesity epidemic. We heard a little bit about that previously. They are concerned about economic inequality. They are concerned about social equality. They're concerned about efficient land use, whatever that means in terms of their idea, and no urban sprawl. In other words, they're looking for a utopian society, and they believe they can accomplish this with enough command and control over your life. So this mirrors very much a lot of what's going on with the social justice movement that we see and identity politics. And it's why a lot of the people that are advocating for what they're advocating for are so passionate about advocating for things which, if you look at the data, don't make a whole lot of sense and that we can easily disprove what they're claiming, but it doesn't have any impact on them. It doesn't make any difference because it is based on this idea that that they have in their minds of an ideology of this utopia that they need to impose on all of us. And so a lot of it has to do with virtue signaling. When they go out and they advocate for these things, they feel good about themselves. They show what a wonderful person they are because they're going to save the world. They're going to make everything perfect and wonderful if you only give them enough control. They talk a lot about privilege in this conversation. You'll hear that a lot. They talk a lot about, there's a lot about this intersectionality, victim statusness. You'll hear a lot about victimhood. These people are victims who have possibly gotten hurt or injured in an accident, or somebody who is a victim because they can't, because they're in poverty and they can't afford a car, therefore they have to take transit, so they're a victim. For people who don't easily fit into some of these victimhood groups, the way to be a victim is to put yourself into one of these groups. So a lot of these advocates who are advocating for these things are showing themselves as victims, even though they are in a group that would not otherwise be a victim group, say a white male, relatively well-off person who doesn't neatly fall into one of these categories, but they can become a victim if they identify with this victimhood group. So a lot of it has to do with PC culture. A lot of it has to do with cancel culture that you may have heard about in the media, where if you don't agree with them, they come out and they go after you. They want to shut you down. They don't want you to talk. We had somebody here last night when we were meeting who showed up with signs and wanted to shut us down because they were gonna show us what's what because we had the wrong ideas. They also are very much into vilifying people and marginalizing them, and they're into a lot of this class warfare, where you'll hear a lot of this has to do about only rich people want to have cars and they don't care about poor people. So you hear things like, this is being, our ideas here today are being pushed by rich, white, old, and entitled and privileged people. That's the category apparently that everyone in this room falls into. And you'll see a lot of the tactics that they use with regards to this, which comes from a gentleman by the name of Saul Alinsky wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. And you'll see, if you look at his rules, a lot of these things show up in their tactics when they're coming after people who they disagree with. So some of these rules, and I'll just give you a couple of them, is ridicule is man's most potent weapon. Keep the pressure on. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. You'll see that a lot of this is very evident in the language that they now want to use with regards to, say, when you talk about traffic accidents or things like that. So we used to call them traffic accidents. Then we had to start calling them crashes because nothing's an accident. Now they want to call it traffic violence, okay? Which is an idea that there's intent on the part of the person who may have accidentally caused harm to somebody else. So what this is about, a lot of what my fellow panelists talked about was that this is a lot of the consequences of these policies seem like, well, if we're having these consequences, maybe we should do something different. But they don't want to do something different because it's all about penalizing people who drive, because they have decided that driving is bad and we need to penalize people who do that. And the ways that they will do that, there's a number of ways, and we've seen some of them, because they want to increase travel time, they want to increase congestion. So they impose road diets. They change the signal timing in order to make you hit more red lights, not less red lights. They lower the speed limits arbitrarily. They want everybody to go 20 miles an hour in an urban setting. They want to put in parking prohibitions to make it harder to get around. They want to impose congestion pricing to penalize you for driving your car. They want to put in car-free areas. And there's a lot having to do with automated vehicles, which we could do an entire conference on in terms of how they will control your life. But I want to share with you, in the last few minutes that I have here, a couple of things. And there was an article in the New York Times, I believe yesterday, October 4th, and it was sort of a gift for this conference. And the title is, "Cars Are Death Machines, Self-Driving Tech Won't Change That." And so now you might think from that title that this article was, this opinion piece was going to be about how self-driving cars won't improve the safety issues that might be out on the roadways today. But that's not what this is about. And I want to read you some things that were said. This is, I'm only reading parts of the article. I have the whole thing, and you can find it online, obviously. But the author starts talking about the stories of the people who have been hurt in automobile violence. And she says it like this. She says, "Most of us have stories like this, a car coming into our lives and unleashing horrendous damage on our loved ones, friends, family, and even ourselves. Cars are death machines." Yeah. So there are many who say that autonomous or smart cars will solve this. So far, I'm unpersuaded. Since 2014, over $80 billion has been spent on smart or connected cars and autonomous vehicles, arguably to make cars safer. But investing in the car of the future is investing in the wrong problem. We need to be thinking about how we can create a world with fewer cars. That's the entire extent of what this article talks about autonomous vehicles. In terms of making an argument that they won't change that. And she goes on, among the safety measures proposed by car companies are encouraging pedestrians and bicyclists to use RFID tags, which emit signals that cars can detect. This means it's becoming the pedestrian's responsibility to avoid getting hit. Imagine that, taking responsibility for your own safety. It's a terrible thing in her mind. But if keeping people safe means putting the responsibility on them, we need to think twice about the technology that we're developing. Just a few more things. She says, this may be the worst outcome of the automobile-centered 20th century, the assumption that it's people who need to get out of the way of these lethal machines instead of the other way around. Car manufacturers are producing more SUVs than ever before, a shift that has led to a 69% increase in pedestrian fatalities. Because the front end of an SUV is higher than the average car's front end, it is far more likely to hit a pedestrian in the chest or head, and twice as likely to kill walkers, runners, cyclists, children, compared to regular cars. And yet SUVs sales account for 60% of new vehicle sales. Yes, because people like driving SUVs. They're useful vehicles, and they help you get around. And they're also, if you're driving as an SUV, much safer than a regular automobile. One of the easiest ways, she says, to make cars safer would be to make them smaller. That is, to mandate what cars you can have. Another way, figuring out how to get people to drive less by providing safer, more sustainable alternatives to the car. Banning all passenger auto-driving vehicles above a certain weight and front grille height would be a great start. Other solutions run the gamut from reducing speed limits, eliminating right turns on red, building protected bike lanes, and instituting congestion pricing. All ways of penalizing people who drive cars. Rethinking land use to encourage walkable developments rather than sprawl. And she concludes with, we can all commit to driving less, which reduces both CO2 emissions, saving the planet, and the potential for crashes. We need to be as defensive about crosswalks and bike lanes as drivers are about their cars. Until then, the streets will belong to the death machines. Now, I have many more pages. I have 1 minute left. And so what I want to share with you is one final quote. And this mirrors what Phil Washington is quoted as saying. There was one of these bike and pet advocates that was interviewed by LA Metro online magazine. And they asked him, how would you encourage Angelenos to use transit? And his answer was, make using a car slower and more inconvenient than a bicycle or transit. Stop encouraging car use with an abundant and convenient supply of free parking spaces. In other words, let's penalize the people who are driving cars. Let's make their lives more difficult because they're bad people. They're puppies that need to be wrapped on the nose because they are doing the wrong thing. We need to change their behavior. We need to tell them how to live their lives. One thing I know from my life, in addition to that, you know how to live your life better than I do, is that freedom of your choice, freedom of how you get around, where you live, is a benefit unto itself. And no amount of top-down planning that supposedly creates this utopia is ever going to replace the benefit that we have by making our own choices and being able to live our own lives free of the utopian planners who want to control everything about what we do. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions of our panelists. You're all welcome to jump in and answer them. And then after that, we're going to open it up to your Q&A. So we'll begin there. So my first question is, I'm going to give you a little bit of context. Alan Bertode, in his book, Order Without Design, says, urban planning is a craft learned through practice. Planners make rapid decisions that have an immediate impact on the ground. The width of streets, the minimum size of land parcels, the heights of buildings. The language they use to describe their objectives is qualitative, sustainable, livable, resilient, often with no link to measurable outcomes. Urban economics, on the other hand, is a quantitative science based on theories, models, and empirical evidence largely developed in academic settings. What are practical ways the divide between urban planning and urban economics can be bridged so that planning could have an appropriate and useful role in our cities?
The first thing we can do, we really need to get urban planning to use the economics that out there on an objectives type basis. And really that is, Jane Jacobs, going back to Jane Jacobs, and I'm sorry I don't have the exact quote, I don't have time to get it out of the machine, said something like, if urban planning helps people, then their lives should be better as a result. Well, let me tell you, in Los Angeles and in California and in Portland and Seattle and London and Sydney and Hong Kong, people's lives are not better because of urban planning, because it has driven the price of housing through the roof so that poor people and middle-income people cannot afford housing, because it has increased the time of commuting so that many people can't get to the jobs that are available throughout the urban area. So my sense is we need to start all over. In fact, the one step that Alain did not take in his book that I wish he had would have been to suggest that we replace the departments of urban planning with departments of urban economics, whose job it was to make sure that we're improving affluence and reducing poverty.
Unfortunately, most urban planning schools are part of schools of architecture and not part of schools of economics or real estate or anything like that. Winston Churchill once said, we make our buildings or we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And a lot of urban planners consider that inspirational. They think if they shape our cities, that our cities will shape the people in the cities. I think the solution is to take urban planners and put them in re-education camps and make them productive members of society doing something other than urban planning.
I disagree with everything that was said. So.
Okay. What criteria would you use for whether an existing road should be widened or narrowed?
Well, to answer that question, I have to state I'm an economist. I think economics works best when people pay for what they use and they don't have to pay for what other people use. And the best way to do that is controversial, is to replace the gas taxes and vehicle registration fees we now use to pay for our roads with mileage-based user fees, so that you pay by the mile, and the amount you pay goes to whoever you drive the road on. If you drive on a city street, the money you pay goes to the city. If you drive on a county road, it goes to the county. If you drive on a private road, it goes to that private entity, and each of them get to set the price that you pay to drive on their roads. And then, if they earn a surplus in money, they're going to say, hey, we can make even more money if we widen the road. And that's the criteria that should be used to widen the road. If it can pay itself off. If you have to subsidize it, you shouldn't do it. And for most cities, that means most new road construction is going to be at the urban fringe where land is cheap and development in the area is growing. In the heart of the city, it's really expensive to widen roads, and while I can conceive there might be some places where it'll happen, I don't think it's going to happen very often.
Let me slightly disagree with that. I do not believe the answer is road pricing. I am very pleased with the work that is being done around the country, and here's one place where I will compliment LA. And I was involved in the original vote on the elevated busway on the Harbor Freeway back in the 70s to put in the express toll lanes and all that kind of thing. That works very well. The criteria very simply should be if the road has extra capacity, there's no reason you can't reduce the size of the road if you don't interfere with the travel time, etc. If it needs more capacity, you ought to provide it. There are all sorts of financing difficulties there. But the fact is that when we start talking about about putting tolls on everything, again, let us go to the south side of LA, or let's go to East LA before gentrification and ask what impact that's going to have on people. I don't trust government to take the proceeds and give it back to the people. I don't trust government a bit. That's why I have a slightly different view, though respect Randall's view.
Okay. Have road...
Okay. May I?
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah. My short answer to this is I would use a data-driven approach, which is very much what my fellow panelists have said, which is that if the road has a certain amount of capacity and it is over capacity currently, you certainly don't want to take away lanes. That would be the first thing you wouldn't want to do. If you have the space to provide additional capacity and you need it, then you make that decision based on the economics of the situation. But with regard to pricing things and pricing roadways, my personal feeling kind of falls in between my fellow panelists, which is I'm actually not really opposed to pricing of an additional lane if that pricing pays for a new lane. But pricing things that we've already paid for through our tax dollars, I think, is unfair and unwarranted.
Okay, thank you. Have road diets been successful anywhere? If so, what makes them successful?
I'm going to take that. I guess the answer to that question is who do you ask? Okay, because if your goal is to make people miserable and to make life more difficult on people, this is a very successful road diet. If your goal is to improve people's lives, I don't know of very many places where there are. I'm sure there might be where there might be a place where changing the built environment in a small city center area where maybe it was overbuilt in some way. I don't know how it got there, but if you want to change the environment because it's not really necessary for more capacity, then maybe it's possible. I'm certainly open to the idea that a road diet could be successful depending on how it's done, but this is certainly not the way to do it.
Let me just offer an example that's way out of the way. Many of you have probably heard of Curitiba, Brazil, which has a marvelous busway system, carries more people on it than certainly any system in the United States that's a rapid transit system, except for maybe New York. City of about 3 million people, busways all over the place. Now, what they did with the busways, they were surface busways, and there continues to be the unbelievable pressure to turn them into subways. For what reason, God knows why. But in any event, what they did when they built these busways was, we created, of course, sort of a road diet. They had to take the busways are largely middle lane busways on 4 or 5 corridors leaving from the central business district, which has a whole lot more employment percentage-wise in the area than the average U.S. city. So we have taken 2 lanes out of the middle of these thoroughfares going out of central Curitiba. That's road diet. So what did they do? Well, they needed to keep the traffic moving. What a lot of people who go to Curitiba do not realize, and what I know Tom has seen, and what I have seen, and I just stumbled on it. 1 block on either side of each of the busways is a huge traffic one-way street for cars. 1 way north-south on this, north on this side, and 1 way south on this side. Traffic works beautifully. That is a successful road diet in my view.
Thank you very much. All right, my last question for you, and then we're going to go to the audience, is what are some helpful and effective ways to communicate with people who support road diets and Vision Zero planning to neutralize hostility and bridge divides?
What if there are no?
Well, I'm asking if there are. Think creatively.
Considering I was a person that was probably the most critical today so far, I think there are ways to engage with people, but here's the problem. first and foremost, which is you have to have a willing partner. If you don't have a willing partner, somebody who is willing to engage with you in an honest and open and fair conversation, then no matter what you do and no matter what you say, it matters. But the other thing is, and I really feel this way, especially about elected officials and other people in the elected realm, is you have to understand what people's motivations are. You have to understand what their self-interest is. And if you can provide for them whatever they need for their self-interest and also get what is best for the rest of us as well, then there may be a way to bridge that gap. But like I said, you have to have a willing partner on the other side. If you don't, doesn't matter. I don't think it matters what you say.
What is the Mao Zedong quote? Something like, democracy works best at the point of diplomacy works best at the point of a gun. I think we need to put planners under gunpoint, but I'm speaking figuratively. I have observed all across the country that we win when we win a lawsuit and it changes everything, or we win an election and it changes everything. If you have a city council that's supporting the urban planners and somebody says, I'm against the urban planners, and they win a city council seat, often the other city council members will be in fear of their jobs and they'll change their minds too. And suddenly the urban planners have a lot less influence. So that's what I recommend, is organize, win lawsuits, win elections.
And I think it's great of everybody to engage with urban planners and to try to convince them, but I think you need to recognize the reality. This doesn't mean you shouldn't communicate with them and continue to try to communicate it with them. But let us say that our role is, we're about, say, in the 15th century, and we've decided that the church is all wrong, and we have the data to show it. And so we show up at the local monastery, and we try to convince them of all sorts of things that are wrong with the existing faith of the church. Now let us say that one monk, or even the leader of the monastery, should happen to say, by God, you're right, and comes over to your side. Guy never works again. This is the problem in urban planning. You know, there are reasonable people who would probably be quite willing to be more reasonable on these issues in planning departments. But any planner that really went by the data that's out there would never work again.
I just have one follow-up to that, which is I can attest to that 100% with regards to people who work in the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. I know a number of them. They are scared to death of telling the truth. And they know they'll tell me personally, because they know that I won't out them. But these are, and their names are no. And but seriously, this is absolutely 100% true. They know that they'll lose their jobs if they come out and they tell the truth.
Wow. Okay. All right. So now we're going to open it up to your questions. I think we have time for probably like four or so.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm a former planning commissioner in Huntington Beach, and when I got inside the building, I saw quickly that it wasn't just the green folks who are the sustainable development folks and whatnot, the global warming folks. They're working in concert with the Chamber of Commerce folks, and both sides are feeding each other, and this is kind of creating this behemoth because they're about 95% of all the people that I see that are in office. So I'd love to get your feedback on that and how we fight that.
Well, it depends on what are the Chamber of Commerce folks after. For transit, building rail transit is a lot more lucrative than building highways. You make a lot more profits at it. For one thing, you can build a highway for about a 4-lane freeway for about $10 million a mile. Light rail right now is coming in at $200 million a mile. There's a lot more room for profits. If the chamber, though, is local businesses, and the planners are telling them that, oh, we just need to take away street capacity and increase densities and you'll get more business, then that's an education problem, because we've got evidence here, 25 businesses or so are out of business since they put in this road diet, that what the planners are saying simply isn't true. The builders, they just want to build. they don't care whether they're building low density or high density. If they're not allowed to build low density, they're happy to build high density as long as they can make a profit at it. Oftentimes, you have to subsidize them to make a profit at high density, but the planners don't care because they're using somebody else's money.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say that that's something we didn't really touch on, but the way that I like to describe it with regards to building and development is that in the city of Los Angeles, we really don't have a transit system. We have a developer revenue enhancement system, and that's a bit of a problem as well.
Slightly off the subject, but similar, with respect to the elected officials and so on. I remember I mentioned in '76 Kenny Hahn and how he and his fellows on the Board of Supervisors killed the diamond lane that had been imposed by the state. Elected officials are very important. You saw that list of elected officials up there on my slides who are on the MTA board. These people, I'll bet you that if you were to go to the 5 county supervisors, and I don't know anyone of them, the last one that I knew, Mike Antonovich, left just a couple of years ago. But the point about it is that if you were to go and ask them to sign an agreement that they agreed with Phil Washington, which, by the way, he may have been quoted out of context, that we need to get people out of their car, we need to make it more difficult and so on, I'll bet you would find difficulty finding a majority of them to say that publicly. And those kinds of things need to be involved in the elections, not only at the Board of Supervisors, but at the City of Los Angeles, the counties, I should say the council members, and of course, you know, you have 4 elected officials from other cities in the county that are on that board as well.
Okay, great.
Kenny Hahn's daughter, Janice Hahn, is county board.
Right. Does she have his same? Does she have the same district now? I didn't see.
I think it's
Yeah. Right. Kenny was a great friend.
Hey, hang on to your mic. We have a question over here, and then we're going to go to the gentleman over here, and then the woman in the orange hat. And then if you could speak loudly, but I can also repeat your question.
Sure. There's a lot of micro-mobility that's coming out with the birds. You have the little bike things. How do we make sure that when these innovations and more innovations come in the future, that we have a space for them on our roads? Maybe not specifically on this road, maybe on the other roads. How do you integrate new ways of moving around?
Well, I think bicycle boulevards are great for most of those kinds of micromobility as well. And I think we have to recognize we can't separate bicycles completely. We can't build a whole network of bike paths that's equal to our whole network of arterial and collector roads. At the same time, mixing them up too much is a problem. It's risky, but it also is discouraging. I know John Forrester is going to talk later today, but my experience is that you put in a bike lane, and even if it's more dangerous than it was before, you're going to get more cyclists because they feel safer. So we need to give people a feeling of safety that really is safer rather than just one that's an illusion. I like bicycle boulevards. I think that works for a wide range of uses. The great thing about streets, unlike rails, unlike a lot of other things, is that they are used by every kind of transportation: trucks, buses, cars, bicycles, whatever. We just have to design our system so that they're safe, and as Jay would say, we have to be data-driven about it and not ideologically driven.
Okay. This gentleman right here.
Can any of the board members comment on the alliance between urban planners and big tech, the people who want to force us into automated cars, who want us to use e-scooters so that they can spy on our every movements? They're doing this under the disguise of environmentalism and reducing traffic, aren't they?
I'm not sure there is an alliance there, because I don't think the urban planners have even figured out that high tech is out there. The urban planners want to turn us back to the 1920s, and high tech just throws a monkey wrench in all their plans. So, and I also am not quite as paranoid about what the high tech people want. I mean, there are definitely companies out there that would love to use our common streets for their private purposes, put birds everywhere or whatever these scooters are, and just have them block out the sidewalks. And at the same time, the people who are trying to design automated cars, they're in a big race to develop the first true automated system so that they can sell it, and they want to essentially rent the cars to you, not sell them to you. And the urban planners They aren't associated with that at all. They haven't figured that out. All they can figure is that that's going to make their lives harder because it's going to get people out of transit and into cars, and they want to stop that. They haven't figured out how to stop it either.
I believe that the Metro is against the bus riders. They want to have the rail project. So what they're actually doing is they're making small buses going from the valley over to West LA by making smaller buses so we're all jammed into the bus. Then they also don't believe on Wilshire Boulevard taking buses to go over to Santa Monica. They take all of them, they go short line, they turn around and go downtown so that they were all stuffed on buses so they could say that everybody's taking buses. Look how crowded it is. They're doing it on purpose. So, and then the next step is look how many people are on the buses. Let's take away the car.
So what's your question?
The question is, do you feel that the metros are against the bus riders along with the people in the cars?
Did everybody get that?
You know, I'm not sure they're against bus riders, but they certainly aren't for them. And Los Angeles Metro has a great track record of 20 years between about 1986 and 1996, and then again between 2006 and today, of losing bus riders to gain rail riders. For every rail rider they've gained, they've lost 5 bus riders. And that's an excellent track record if you want to make the case that they're against bus riders. I think if they really had an excuse for that, they would say, hey, all the low-income people are buying cars anyway, and they're not riding buses. Our goal now is to attract high-income people out of their cars. And nationwide, that seems to be the goal of the transit industry. Low-income people, all the data show, are fleeing transit. The transit's growth market is people who earn $75,000 a year or more, and the argument is that they'll only ride trains, they won't ride buses. I disagree with that. I think you can have luxury buses that'll attract people who are high-income earners, but I don't see why we have to subsidize them in the first place. Let private industry attract them.
And then just to focus on this again, because I keep coming back to it because it's so often missed, you have to understand what a niche market transit is. Remember, almost 60% of the destinations of transit work trips in this country are in 6 cities. The city of San Francisco, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, and New York. Not their suburbs. These cities have about 6 to 7% of the jobs in the country. Yet they have 60% of the ridership. You are never going to get much above the current ridership in terms of market share in Los Angeles on transit. It just isn't going to happen. And that needs to be understood. I oftentimes hear people, saw a column on road diets here when I was trying to do a little bit of research for this presentation. And this wonderful columnist was trying to explain how, oh, Los Angeles is different. No, Los Angeles isn't different. It's the same as the suburbs of New York and the suburbs of Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, and wherever the 6th one was. I can't remember at the moment. But the basic point is we need to understand the limits of transit. We do not get up in the morning having an opportunity or an alternative to the automobile for most of our lives. Now, for me, coming from Chatsworth, the express bus running, the old 721 that ran from Chatsworth to downtown, was just wonderful. When the bank I was working for said, hey, you know what, you need to look for another job in the bank because you might have to be laid off, they said, why don't you go down to the El Segundo facility? You know, that's where the El Segundo Times is published now. Well, in any event, I went down there. Took about an hour and a half from Chatsworth, and I was doing all sorts of illegal things to get through signals to do it. And that would be the situation there. If you, I forgot to put this in my presentation. Take a look at the metro planning thing on the internet, where you can get on and you can say I'm at X point and I want to go to Y point. Put in some things, put in some of your trips, and then find out, and then think about or look at what it would take you by car. You will be stunned. If you can get there in double the time on transit, you're going to do better than most, because most places you can't even get to.
Okay, on that note, that's all the time that we have for this panel, so let's thank our panelists.